This Honorable Court of Tennessee is now in session.
Welcome to the October session of the Court of Criminal Appeals in the Eastern Division. The panel today is Judge Camille McMullen from Memphis, Judge Jill Barty Ayers from Clarksville. I'm Kelly Thomas from Maryville. Before we begin, I want to thank Nick Morgan and Francesca Kraft for their help. I promise you, were it not for what they've done, this would not be happening and I wouldn't be seeing anybody and nobody would see me. So thank you for that. You'll have 20 minutes per side as usual. If the appellant wants to reserve some time for rebuttal, please let me know and we will do that. I will let you know when you're within a couple of minutes of the boundaries of your argument, whichever that may be. And I think that's about it. So if you will call the next case, please.
State of Tennessee versus Terrance Reece.
All right. Ms. Moore.
May it please the court, I'd like to reserve 5 minutes for rebuttal.
Okay. You may go ahead.
The verdict in this case should be overturned because the trial court erroneously found by clear and convincing evidence that Mr. Reece threatened one of the alleged victims, Ronald Solomon, outside the courtroom during a break in the middle of trial. This erroneous finding led to the improper admission of witness testimony concerning the mid-trial threat, thereby presenting the jury with unfairly prejudicial propensity evidence. The jury convicted Mr. Reece of 4 counts of felon in possession of a firearm, 1 count of vandalism, and 3 counts of aggravated assault with a firearm. They acquitted Mr. Reece of the 4th count of aggravated assault against Ronald Solomon. There was no physical evidence in this case. There was no gun found on Mr. Reece or in the vehicle that Mr. Reece was driving that day. The verdict turned on the credibility of the witnesses. The state presented 3 witnesses that said Mr. Reece possessed a gun. All 3 of those witnesses were Solomon's. The defense presented 3 witnesses that said Mr. Reece didn't have a gun, including the only unbiased witness, the Solomon's neighbor, Curtis Phillips. The importance of the credibility of the witnesses made the trial within a trial that much more important and that much more prejudicial. At trial, within minutes of returning from break, the court concluded the testimony of the first witness and then excused the jury. And the court told the parties that he had just learned an officer had overheard Mr. Reece threaten one of the alleged victims during the break. The court did not give the parties any further notice beyond what was just said. The court did not tell defense trial counsel the nature of the hearing, further information about the allegations. The trial court did not give the defense time to speak to her client, time to speak to the witnesses, time to prepare a defense or investigate the allegations. The court immediately began taking testimony from Ronald Solomon and James Harper. As it turns out, Mr. Harper was not an officer, but worked in the building and knew the Solomons from church before these allegations were made. Following the testimony of Mr. Solomon and Mr. Harper, there were clear contradictions between the 2 men's version of events that had occurred less than 30 minutes prior. Those clear contradictions included things like where Giselle and Callie Solomon were when the alleged threat was made and whether the 2 men even knew each other. These contradictions were exacerbated 2 days later when the courthouse security footage was played for the court. The courthouse security footage showed that these 2 men were not only contradictory in their testimony, but just lied to the court. The trial court fell victim to the Solomon's willingness to do whatever they had to do to get Mr. Reece out of their lives. The failure to give the parties time to investigate and prepare for this hearing deprived the court of the truth and led to the clear and convincing to the erroneous finding that there was clear and convincing evidence that the alleged threat was made. Following this initial hearing, the trial court reserved ruling on the admissibility of the witness testimony regarding the alleged mid-trial threat, finding that the danger of unfair prejudice outweighed the probative value. However, the trial court revoked Mr. Reece's bond at that time. Today, Mr. Reece is not asking this court to reinstate Mr. Reece's bond. Obviously, reinstatement is moot. However, State v. Bergens lays out a procedure for the lower courts to follow in order to protect a defendant's due process rights when allegations are made against a defendant who is out on bond. This procedure is meant to prevent the court from rushing to judgment based on unfounded allegations. The court's failure to follow this procedure and the procedural deprivation cascaded into the erroneous, clear and convincing finding and on the 404 evidence. These issues ultimately came to a head during Giselle Solomon's testimony. Defense trial counsel sought to introduce allegations that Mrs. Solomon had made against Mr. Solomon regarding his history of violence. During a bench conference, the court noted that there had been no testimony that Mr. Reece pointed a gun at Mr. Solomon, and there was no need for a self-defense theory, but ultimately allowed defense trial counsel to proceed with this line of questioning with a warning that it would open the door to other 404 evidence. After Giselle Solomon's testimony and Callie Solomon's testimony, the court made its official ruling on the admissibility of the mid-trial threat. The court reversed its previous finding and determined that the probative value of motive and intent increased with the testimony regarding Mr. Solomon's character for violence. However, the probative value of motive and intent could not have increased if there was no evidence that Mr. Reece committed the underlying offense. A day and a half later, the courthouse security footage was acquired by defense counsel. This likely would have happened sooner, but the court or the public building authority refused to release the video to defense counsel, which caused an unnecessary delay. With proper time and the court's authority, the footage likely could have been procured on the first day of trial, which would have allowed the court to view the courthouse security footage in light of the testimony from James Harper and Ronald Solomon. And this would have prevented the erroneous finding of that this occurred by clear and convincing evidence. In a case that hinged on witnesses' credibility, the improper testimony from Mr. Solomon and Mr. Harper about the alleged mid-trial threat so muddied the waters that the jury's verdict cannot be divorced from the unfairly prejudicial, improper propensity evidence. As the trial court noted, quote, "If I let this in and it's wrong, it certainly could be grounds for a reversal." The courthouse security video proved that the court was wrong to admit the witness testimony regarding the mid-trial threat. On this issue, we ask that you follow the trial court's guidance and reverse the conviction. Additionally, the trial court failed to tailor the Ferguson-Merriman jury instruction to identify the bullet jewelry as the evidence that the state failed to preserve. While the charge conference is not in the record, this court may infer that defense trial counsel requested the duty to preserve instruction based on the court's pretrial order, which required defense trial counsel to make a contemporaneous request for this instruction, and the existence of the pattern instruction in the court's final jury instructions. This missing evidence or missing bullet jewelry evidence from the state either would have been exculpatory or would have been the only evidence from the state that Mr. Reece possibly, the only physical evidence from the state that Mr. Reece possibly possessed a gun that day. However, as Mr. Reece testified, this was not actually a bullet, but a piece of jewelry. And he found this in his friend's vehicle that day. The Knoxville police officers determined that it was immaterial to their case. As such, there is a clear inference or implication that Mr. Reece was telling the truth. It was not, in fact, a bullet, but bullet jewelry. In a case that involved an allegation of a firearm, and the absence of discovery of a firearm, the existence of a bullet would be material to most police. The fact that they rejected this as unnecessary or irrelevant to them bolsters Mr. Reece's credibility, and as such, absent exclusion of the evidence, a jury instruction that the court deemed appropriate and proper to introduce or give to the jury should have been tailored to identify the missing evidence so that the jury was not left to their own devices to conclude what the court meant. And the instruction given was not in line with the court's guidance from in State v. Merriman. Additionally, there are the other issues included in the motion are grounds for reversal. Not only did the court allow this testimony regarding this alleged mid-trial threat, but repeated references to other 404 evidence was included, namely prior abuse allegations, alleged drug use, alleged gang affiliations, and other criminal behavior. The court even allowed multiple witnesses to testify that Mr. Reece had hidden compartments in his vehicle, so the police must have missed the gun because it was hidden in a hidden compartment. However, Mr. Reece was not driving one of his vehicles, so the idea of a hidden compartment was completely irrelevant because there's no evidence that Mr. Reece created hidden compartments in his friends' vehicles. I will conclude my initial argument with reiteration that this verdict turned entirely on witness credibility, and the admission of evidence under 404B or 404A created an unfair prejudice, and that admission stemmed from the court's erroneous finding that the event occurred by clear and convincing evidence. A finding that could have been prevented had the court given Mr. Reece's counsel time to investigate and not deprived Mr. Reece of his due process rights. Thank you.
When that security footage was obtained, how was that handled? Was it played to the jury and shown to the jury?
It was. Ultimately, the Public Building Authority, or PBA, did not release the footage to defense trial counsel, but instead the state procured a copy and brought it to court that morning. So the first time that defense trial counsel viewed the video was with the court just before the jury was brought in. And then the state handle the playing of the video, despite the fact that it was introduced during the defendant's case in chief. And it is unclear from the record how much of the video was played.
We have it.
It is trial exhibit 11.
Okay.
And the motion for new trial hearing largely focused, if not exclusively focused, on a minute-by-minute breakdown of that video.
Okay. All right. Thank you. General Brandon.
Your honors, and may it please the court, Cody Brandon for the state of Tennessee. We respectfully request that this court affirm the judgments of the trial court. First, your honors, to turn to the hearing following defendant's mid-trial death threat to a witness, there's two distinct issues that arose from that incident in the middle of the trial. The first was the trial court's decision to revoke defendant's bail and order that he remain in custody for the remainder of the trial. That issue, as I believe counsel conceded, is moot now because the decision of the Bergens issue can no longer entitle a defendant to relief. So this court doesn't need to address that issue. The second issue is the admission later in trial of evidence concerning defendant's mid-trial threat. And there, the trial court followed all of the procedures required by 404B and properly admitted evidence under that rule. It held a jury out hearing on, on the evidence concerning the threat. It found that the evidence was material to prove defendant's intent to cause the Solomons to fear bodily injury. They had a settled purpose to harm them and cause them fear. It found the evidence of the threat to the witness to be clear and convincing. And it found after defendant attacked the character of Mr. Solomon and alleged that he was the primary aggressor, it found the probative value of admitting that evidence to outweigh the danger of unfair prejudice. So for those reasons, the trial court properly admitted the evidence of the mid-trial threat at trial. With respect to the other evidentiary objections, the 911 call recordings that defendant objects to first are not included in the appellate record. So this court must presume that the findings of the trial court are correct in the admission of the 911 call recordings. But even if they were included on appeal or supplemented by this court, defendant did not object to their admission of trial. So defendants waived that issue on appeal. And with respect to the admission of testimony concerning the bullet found in defendant's pocket, defendant waived relief of a Ferguson instruction at the trial court considered the Ferguson motion, denied the relief of suppression or dismissal of the indictment, and kept open the possibility of issuing a Ferguson instruction to the jury. There's no record before this court that defense counsel ever requested that instruction. After a quick review of the record, I could not find any copy of the jury instructions. It's possible that I overlooked those. If the trial court did instruct the jury on Ferguson, then defendant received that requested relief and of course would not be entitled to reverse his conviction for getting what he asked for. But to my recollection, again, there's no evidence in the appellate record that defendant requested that instruction before the jury was charged, nor is there a copy of the jury instructions in the appellate record. With respect to the relief that the trial court did deny on the record, suppression or dismissal of the indictment, the trial court correctly found that the officer's destruction or loss of the bullet did not warrant dismissal of the indictment or suppression of evidence. Testimony concerning the bullet, those are both drastic remedies that are reserved for egregious cases of police misconduct or where the trial would be fundamentally unfair without the evidence. In this case, the trial court correctly found that the evidence concerning the bullet was very minimal compared to the testimony of 4 witnesses concerning defendant's possession of a gun at the Solomon's house and threatening them to shoot them. So for those reasons, the trial court correctly denied the relief of suppression or dismissal of the indictment under Ferguson. Unless your honors have further questions about those issues or about other issues not addressed in argument today, the state would respectfully request that this court affirm the judgment of the trial court.
Thank you. You have 5 minutes for any rebuttal that you wish to make.
Thank you, Your Honors. Regarding the 911 calls and their, I guess, preservation in the record, the prejudice created by the 911 calls is preserved in the trial court's ruling after the 911 calls were played for the jury. When defense trial counsel objected to Giselle Solomon's testimony about 404B conduct. The trial court the state argued and then the trial court agreed that the bell had been rung by the 911 calls, that all of the allegations Mrs. Solomon was testifying to were already in front of the jury because of the 911 calls. So the prejudice aspect of those 911 calls is preserved in the record, even though the state somehow failed to properly admit those exhibits into evidence. Further, the jury instructions can be found in the exhibit volume, trial exhibit number 12, and I believe the duty to preserve instruction is page, it is page 11 of exhibit 12. So the court may find the jury instructions on that page. Once again, while the instruction was given, it was the pattern instruction without any detail to the case. So the trial court's instruction left it to the jury to determine what possible evidence the state failed to preserve and what possible weight to give that. The court under Merriman has a duty to identify that based on the relief requested by defense trial counsel. Defense trial counsel focused on this missing bullet jewelry and did not make a broad objection. Therefore, the court had a duty to tailor the instruction to instruct the jury on what to do. Failure to do so hindered the jury's ability to properly consider the evidence. Finally, on the sufficiency of the evidence argument, the jury acquitted Mr. Reece of aggravated assault on Ronald Solomon. However, they convicted for aggravated assault of Giselle Solomon, Callie Solomon, and Jacqueline Solomon. Jacqueline Solomon testified as a defense witness and told the jury that she not only lied on the 911 call about shots being fired, but lied about Mr. Reece ever having a gun. She also testified that she was never in fear, that if you listen to the 911 calls, you can hear her laughing. The jury's verdict is in direct opposition to her testimony. There is no subjective or objective belief that she was in fear. And as for Callie and Giselle Solomon, they also failed to testify that they were in fear. And further, their actions contradict that of an objective standard that they were in fear. Both Giselle and Callie testified that they walked towards Mr. Reece after he approached with a gun. Most, if not all people presented with the threat of a firearm do not leave the safety of a shed or a building to walk towards someone that they're afraid of. So it's our position that there was neither subjective nor objective evidence that either Mrs. Solomon or Callie Solomon were in fear of Mr. Reece. Even if he had a gun, which we contend he did not, as evidenced by the testimony of the only unbiased witness, Curtis Phillips. And once again, we ask that you reverse this conviction and remand to the trial court for further proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your arguments. We will be in recess.
This Honorable Court of Tennessee is now in recess.